Okay, it's time again for the Press Box Podcast. This is episode number 101. It's our college football recap of week number 7. I'm Ralph Miranda. I'll be joined by Nathan Miranda, our producer, shortly. We've been a great week in college football. A couple key games. We're getting closer and closer to that first ranking by the College Football Playoff Committee. That'll clear a lot of things up for us, and we've got a really good show for you today as we discuss who we think is going to be there when the dust all settles the end of November. Remember, at PressBoxPod is our Twitter handle. At PressBoxPod is our Instagram handle. The PressBox Podcast is our YouTube channel, and we want you to interact with us. We hope that you're enjoying the podcast, and we look forward to bringing it to you each and every week. So without further ado, episode 101, College Football Recap, week number 7 on the PressBox Podcast. Okay, welcome back to the Press Box Podcast. Hi, I'm your co-host, Ralph Miranda, along with our producer, Nathan Miranda. And today we are looking at college football again. This is our college football recap for week number 7 in college football. Another exciting week. We had some more upsets, as we are wont to do in college football as the season progresses. We had some surprises. We had some games go exactly as we thought they should go. But let's go ahead and get started, as we usually do, by showing you the Associated Press Top 25, or reading that to you. Once again, Georgia is the undisputed number 1 team in the country. They received 63 first-place votes. That's all of them. They are number 1 again. Cincinnati has moved up to number 2. They are 6-0. Oklahoma has moved up to number 3. They are 7-0. Alabama is number 4 at 6-1. Ohio State is number 5 at 5-1. Michigan is number 6 at 6-0. Penn State, 7th at 5-1. Oklahoma State is 6-0 at number 8. Michigan State is 9th at 7-0. Oregon is 10th at 5-1. Iowa dropped from number 2 to number 11 following their upset loss to Purdue. They are 6-1. Ole Miss is number 12 at 5-1. Notre Dame is number 13 at 5-1. Coastal Carolina undefeated at number 14. Kentucky dropped from 11 to 15. By losing to Georgia. They are 6-1 at number 15 right now. Wake Forest is 16th undefeated. Texas A&M 17th, 5-2. North Carolina State is 18th at 5-1. Auburn is 19th at 5-2. Baylor is 20th at 6-1. SMU 21. San Diego State 22. They're both undefeated. Pittsburgh is 23, 5-1. University of Texas at San Antonio is 24th at 7-0. And Purdue enters the top 25 at number 25. By virtue of their upset win over number 2 Iowa. They are 4-2 as well. So, Nathan, I guess the story of the week really is Iowa's loss, and I was pretty much adamant last week during our podcast saying that they were not going to lose to Purdue. I didn't even give it much of a thought that it could happen, but they were pretty much throttled by Purdue, 24-7.
I agree. I think I said the same thing. I definitely know I felt the same way that Iowa wasn't going to lose another game. Well, I don't know if I know the game, but they weren't going to lose.
We didn't think they were going to lose.
I didn't think so. Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah, so I was very surprised that they lost to Purdue. But I mean, I don't know what to say about that. Really, just I think we all. I don't know if we discussed this, but I think we all felt that once if they made it to the playoffs, they weren't going to be a team that was really going to be able to make any noise.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
But I thought they'd make the playoff though, so that was strange. Now they definitely won't. Obviously,
no, they won't. They won't.
But did you see any of the game? Did you?
I did. I watched. I watched.
Your impressions of it?
My impressions of it was that they just. I mean, their offense, they couldn't do anything. I mean, the 24-7 is quite a beatdown when you're playing at home against an unranked Purdue team. Notre Dame beat Purdue. Really didn't struggle that much with Purdue. I mean, they struggled a little bit, but the game was never in doubt. Purdue does have a good offense. They have a good quarterback and some good receivers. but Iowa's defense was not able to contain them, and Purdue never gave them. It's almost like Purdue put their foot on their neck and never really let up to give them any air because Iowa could never really mount any kind of comeback. And the thing is, they're probably kicking themselves because really, I mean, after that, like we talked about last week, they're at Wisconsin this coming week. Or I take that back. They're off this week. Then they're at Wisconsin. So had they beaten Purdue, they'd have a week off to kind of get healthy and regroup. And then at Wisconsin, at Northwestern, two very winnable games. Wisconsin's offense is very poor. And then home against Minnesota and home against Illinois and then at Nebraska. So
we thought they were going to go undefeated.
We thought they were going to go undefeated, yeah.
And, I mean, assuming this loss doesn't dampen their spirits or they feel like they have nothing to play for, I think they still will win out.
I think they will too, yeah.
And then, like we talked about this some last week too, which if you want to play the whole game of, well, this team Team A beat Team B, and Team C beat Team A, so Team C is better than Team B, that type of thing.
Right.
If you want to play that whole game of strength of schedule stuff, this makes Notre Dame look a lot better.
It does.
But I know you talked about you don't necessarily buy that whole strength of schedule. You say each game is its own entity, right? You can't really look at, well, this team beat another higher ranked team 3 weeks ago. It's just, each game is its own little ecosystem or its own little what do you call it?
Its own little entity, if you will. Yeah.
So you don't really buy this. This does make Notre Dame look better, I think, to the voters or whatever. But you don't really buy it in your mind that it makes Notre Dame that much.
I don't. No, I think it will. It has an effect to the committee that will vote on the college football rankings. But I don't think it makes much difference.
You don't feel any better about Notre Dame now after last week than you did before. Okay?
No, because trying to tell me that, like you said, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. But Notre Dame played Purdue, almost 4 weeks ago. Okay, so you can't tell me that's the same Purdue team that played against Iowa for two reasons. One, Purdue had to go into Notre Dame Stadium, and they did play pretty well. Yeah. But this was a conference game, all right, and it was on the road. Okay. So, but still, you can't tell me that you can make that adjustment. Yeah. You know what I mean?
I think I've probably always been one to think that way. Think, oh well, this would Notre Dame maybe is better than I ever thought because Purdue beat a high ranked team, Notre Dame beat Purdue. But after you made your case about it, I agree with you. I think I never totally bought into that, but I guess I thought there was some. I don't know. I didn't totally buy into that theory, but I'm more and more I think about it after this last week. I agree that. You can't play that type of you can't play that type of game because, like you said, each game's its own thing, and who knows what external factors went into something, or what, like you said, home versus away or conference game, or you never know what went into stuff. So
Well, another thing you can't factor in is that there's too many external factors. Okay, in other words, let's take Notre Dame for example. Okay, we talked last week about the fact that if Notre Dame wins out and goes 11-1, and Cincinnati's 12-0. That makes Cincinnati's win over Notre Dame look a lot better, right? Okay, that's true, but you got to factor the fact in that Notre Dame has a new defensive coordinator. They had lots of injuries on their offensive line. Their offensive line from week 1 to week 11 could get a whole lot better. The defense could be more comfortable with the new coordinator system. So how Notre Dame is playing at the end of the season is not really a reflection of how they played at week number 4, right? And the same with Cincinnati. So there's too many factors that go on. Now with Alabama, it's not quite the same, right? Same coaching staff, great athlete. I mean, so maybe a little bit there, but still I don't buy into the fact that you can make that jump and say, hey, this is the case.
Which is why the whole strength of schedule thing is ridiculous. But that's the only way they can do it because they don't have a better
correct.
system.
Now, what Iowa has to hope for, Iowa now is tied for the lead in the Big Ten West with Purdue and Minnesota. So Iowa has to hope that Purdue loses again because otherwise Purdue would win the West by virtue of their win over Iowa. But my point is, if Iowa wins the West, they would play the winner of the Big Ten East. Now, Michigan State's 4-0, Ohio State's 3-0. Michigan's 3-0. Ohio State has to play Michigan. Michigan State has to play Michigan. So there's going to be a winner there. So what I'm trying to say is if Iowa can win out and can win the Big Ten championship, all right, then you go back and look at the top 25, okay? They've got to hope for some more chaos, right? They've got to hope. Michigan State may lose. Michigan may lose. Oklahoma State's got to play. So there's a possibility, slight as it may seem, that Iowa could jump back into the race. But what they have to hope is that there's enough one-loss teams outside of the top 2, all right? Because we don't think Georgia's going to lose. We don't think Cincinnati's going to lose. But Oklahoma could lose. Alabama, Ohio State have already lost. Michigan could lose. Iowa beat Penn State, so that negates Penn State. And Oklahoma State and Michigan could lose. So, they, excuse me, they still have a chance, even though a slim chance.
That's a good point. I just looked at that and thought they don't have a chance, but you're right. They do. I mean, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State have to play each other.
Right.
And whoever wins that will be undefeated still,
right.
probably, but they probably have to play a Big 12 championship game.
Right.
So they could knock them out. Like you said, Michigan State, Ohio State, they all are either going to play each other, have to play a big Big 10 championship. So, yeah.
Well, if you look at the teams that are ahead of Iowa, right? I mean, you've got...
But again, though, I mean, there are already some one-loss teams ahead of them, though. Like Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, Alabama. So, like you said, there could be, and they're not going to jump. They're not going to jump Iowa over those teams. I don't think so.
No, unless Iowa. I mean, the best scenario for Iowa would be for Michigan to beat Michigan State. That knocks Michigan State out. For Ohio State to beat Michigan, that knocks them out. All right, and then for Iowa to beat Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. All right, now you've got Iowa up there with all the other one-loss teams. And then it's a possibility.
Yeah, okay? Oklahoma State, one of those, both will not be undefeated.
Correct.
So then it's still, I think they have an outside chance.
An outside chance. Not as much of a lock as they had before, but an outside chance. I think we've already pretty much said that unless Cincinnati has a down week or Stubbs, Cincinnati's going to go undefeated, okay? Georgia right now, I mean, their toughest game left is Florida, okay? And Florida does not look like a team. They lost to LSU, for goodness sake. They gave up LSU 49 points, okay?
Who effectively fired their coach after that.
Right. So I just don't see Georgia losing unless they lose to Alabama in the SEC championship game, which is a possibility, okay? But still, Georgia's going to be in. I mean, I still believe Georgia is in. They may not be number one, but they may get in as the number 4 team.
I will say this, though. Look. Maybe this is a prejudice against non-Power 5 teams. I guess it is, but I think that some of that is warranted, I think. But look at these teams like Georgia, Oklahoma, Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan. You kind of know what you're going to get with these teams, right? Like, they've been around the block. They're Power 5 teams. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But Cincinnati is a lot like Iowa.
Right.
Iowa's Power 5, I know.
Right.
But Iowa's kind of, they're not like like historically great Power 5.
Right,
you know what I mean?
right.
So Cincinnati, in other words, most of these teams you've seen up in the top 5 or 10 recently, except for Iowa and Cincinnati.
Right.
Cincinnati the last few years, maybe they had been last year. But so my point is Cincinnati and Iowa, I think, are similar in that they aren't these big-name teams. There aren't teams that are usually up here. This is uncharted territory for them somewhat.
Right.
I know Cincinnati, I think, was high last year or whatever. But my point is, just as Iowa slept up and beat a team that if you looked at their schedule, you thought there's no way they lose that game.
Right.
Cincinnati maybe loses a game that you think there's no way they lose that game. Because
Right.
they're Cincinnati.
Right.
I'm sorry, but
Right.
you know what I mean? Like I think it's easier to look at Alabama's schedule or Ohio State's schedule and look at the teams they should beat and have more you'd be able to say, like, yeah, they'll beat these teams. But if you look at Cincinnati or Iowa and the teams they should beat, we just saw it's not so black and white, maybe. Then again, I know Alabama lost the team they should have beat. Right. But so maybe I'm just bringing that up as that Cincinnati appears to me to be similar to Iowa.
Yeah, they do.
They never really, how can they handle this in other words?
Well, here's the thing I'm going to say about Cincinnati, and I apologize to any Cincinnati fans who are listening to our podcast, but, Cincinnati had a 17-0 lead on Notre Dame at halftime. Notre Dame changed quarterbacks, and they came back and made it 17-13. And they had a chance to win, to go ahead, all right, but the quarterback misread a pass route down inside the 30-yard line of Cincinnati, okay? Now, they had to punt to Cincinnati. Cincinnati took the ball down and scored. But my point being, if Cincinnati was playing the Notre Dame from last year, they would not have won that game, okay? With Ian Book, my opinion.
No, but that's a little bit of a, ifs and buts were cases and nuts.
No, I know that, but here's what I'm getting at. I'm not saying that as a Notre Dame fan. What I'm saying is that if Cincinnati makes the playoff, okay, I do not see them having a chance against a Georgia or an Alabama, because Georgia and Alabama and even Ohio State are extremely better than Notre Dame this year, and probably were better than Notre Dame last year. Obviously, they were. Alabama beat them. So my point is, I'm glad Cincinnati has a chance to get in, but I don't see them being able to compete. That's all I'm saying.
I know that, yeah, but I mean, and let me look back at Iowa's schedule. Okay, Iowa lost to Purdue, right? And Purdue is
4-2.
4-2. And I'm trying to see I'm trying to see who they beat.
Well, I can tell you who they beat. I mean, Purdue has beaten Oregon State and Connecticut. They lost to Notre Dame. They beat Illinois. They lost to Minnesota, and they beat Iowa.
Okay, so look at the teams they beat. They're not like
Not big name
nothing.
teams.
They're not. They're what?
They're not big. They're not great
No,
teams.
but they're also not like horrible teams.
No, they're not.
But here's my point. Look at Iowa's schedule. Iowa doesn't just play teams coming up. I'm not Iowa. I'm sorry, Cincinnati. Cincinnati doesn't just play teams they should beat coming up. They play teams that are pretty horrible.
Right.
Navy. They play Navy next. I think that's not. No, wait, that's this weekend. I think. The 23rd. Navy's 1-5.
Right.
Then they play 1-5 Tulane.
Right.
All right. Then they play Tulsa, who's 3-4. Then they play 1-5 South Florida.
Right.
Then they play SMU. That would be the game they may lose. SMU's 21 right, 21st undefeated.
Right.
Then they play East Carolina's 3-3. So my point is they have 3 games against 1-5 teams coming up.
Right.
I mean, that's
And really, what's going to hurt Iowa? Again, we've already said we don't buy into this strength of schedule thing, but we know that the committee does.
Yeah,
okay?
they do. Yeah.
Purdue has to play Michigan State at Ohio State.
Oh,
okay?
yeah, they're going to lose some more games.
So they lose those 2 games, and it's not going to look very good that they beat Iowa.
How great would it be if Purdue could knock off all these teams above Iowa, though? That'd be great for Iowa. Because then I don't have to worry about
That's
them,
correct. That's correct.
Anyways.
So anyway, that's the Iowa situation. If we look at some of the other scores from last week, from the completed season or completed week, Auburn beat Arkansas. So Arkansas, even though we thought that they might be a pretty good team when they were ranked 8th and played Georgia, Georgia shut them out, and they've struggled since then. So they're pretty much have fallen down the pack. Oklahoma State came back to beat Texas. So Oklahoma State, I don't think Oklahoma State's that great, but we'll find out about them. Texas A&M hammered Missouri, which you'd expect. Georgia and Kentucky. That was the other game last week that we highlighted. And I think I told you yesterday, we were talking about it. I watched a lot of that game. Georgia did win big, 30-13. But I also want to say Kentucky got the ball. They were down 30-7. They got the ball on their own, I believe it was 25-yard line, and put together basically a 12-play drive and scored with about 4 seconds left in the game. Okay, now Kentucky's a good team. Don't get me wrong. I think they're a solid football team. But really, Georgia hammered them. Okay, I mean, pretty much that last touchdown. They were trying hard to score and all that, but Georgia was trying to stop them. But the game was no longer in doubt. My point is that I think Kentucky's gonna make some noise, and what I mean by that is if you take a look at Kentucky's schedule, let's find Kentucky here. They've only lost 1 game now, and you look at their schedule. They're at Mississippi State this week, which is very winnable. They host Tennessee, which is winnable. They're at Vanderbilt, they'll win that one. They host New Mexico State, they'll win that one, and they're at Louisville. So Kentucky could theoretically be 11-1. All right. My point being, Kentucky's not a bad team. Georgia is just a great football team. Okay, and that's why I think that Georgia is in. I don't see any scenario where they're not in unless something really strange happens.
Well, like we said, I think we said before this game is I want to see how good is. I don't think Kentucky was going to win, but I want to see how good is Kentucky. I think they show that they're actually good.
They're good
because it was 14-7 at halftime.
Right.
I think, which I was surprised about that.
Right.
I mean, they did get killed, but I don't think they should. I think they show that they're a solid team. They're not like a floozy, flaky 6-0. They weren't a flaky 6-0 team. But if they run the table and only have 1 loss, how does that mix up the SEC championship game? Are they in the same?
They're in the same division as Georgia. Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Okay. Yeah, they're not going to be in. That's right.
Well, I guess if they played Georgia, they'd be in the same division.
Yeah. Well, they cross play some teams. Yeah. But I'm saying Kentucky would have to have Georgia lose twice, which is not going to happen. So. But Kentucky's going to go to a very nice bowl game, and they're going to be a solid football team. But yeah, Alabama responded nicely. They beat Mississippi State 49-9. So Alabama's back on track. Let's take a look at Alabama's schedule. I think we've looked at this quite a bit, but let me take a look at it real quick. Alabama. Okay, Alabama is hosting Tennessee this week. I think they're going to win that game. They host LSU. They'll win that game. They host New Mexico State. They'll win that game. They host Arkansas. They'll win that game. And then they're at Auburn. Now, that's going to be an interesting game because that's a real rivalry game. And Auburn's beaten Alabama a couple times late in the season over the past 10 years to ruin Alabama's chances.
Okay.
I don't see Auburn beating them, but it's going to be a challenging game for them. So I think Alabama's going to probably end up 11-1 and probably go to the SEC championship game. So I think, CBS has to be licking their chops because they're probably going to have, assuming nobody gets beat ahead of them, they're going to have number 1 against number 4 in the SEC championship game, which will be, a pretty big matchup there.
Yeah.
So that was the other game, that the Kentucky-Georgia game. Outside of that, there weren't. Let's talk a little bit about. We can't talk about Notre Dame. They were on bye. They will play Southern Cal, which is their big rivalry game coming up this weekend in South Bend. Let's talk about Tennessee and Ole Miss. We watched quite a bit of that game. We'll get into what happened at the end of the game here in a minute. But Ole Miss jumped out to a 24-9 lead. Tennessee kicked a field goal to make it 24-12 at halftime. But then Tennessee fought back. I mean, they were down 31-26 with about, I want to say roughly 3 minutes left in the game. They had a 4th and 24 inside Mississippi territory. They completed a pass right at the line to gain, and the play was reviewed, and it was shown that they were still short. That's when kind of all hell broke loose, and I know everybody's heard already about the fans throwing golf balls and mustard bottles and water bottles and beer cans and whatever else they had down onto the field. I think a golf ball hit Lane Kiffin. The Tennessee cheerleaders had to be escorted off the field as they were holding up signs to protect their head from stuff being thrown. They escorted the Tennessee band off the field or out of the stadium. The game had to be delayed for like 25 minutes. So the Tennessee fan, and don't get me wrong, there was 106,000 people in that stadium, all right? Probably this was a handful of people who did this, maybe 100, if that many. But it gave the whole Tennessee fan base a very bad name nationally. I mean, if you live here in Tennessee like we do, you kind of know it was an odd occurrence that only a few people participated in. But if you live in Wisconsin or you live in Washington, it looks like the Tennessee fan base is a bunch of thugs, okay? So that was a really bad look for Tennessee. I know a lot of Tennessee fans are really embarrassed by it. It should not have happened. But even after that call, Tennessee got the ball back at down by 5, and they had the ball on the Mississippi 20-yard line with 3 seconds left. And the quarterback drops back to pass, couldn't find anybody, runs the ball, and instead of throwing it into the end zone, he runs it out of bounds at the 7-yard line, which basically ended the game. So either he didn't know how much time was left, which is inexcusable, or he made a mistake in execution, which is also inexcusable at that point. So Tennessee, and I bring all that up not to fault the quarterback, but to say Tennessee played pretty well. I mean, they made some mistakes, but that was a pretty good effort by Tennessee. Wouldn't you agree?
I completely agree. I thought the best they could have hoped for was to keep the game close.
And they did that.
If they won, that would have been like a huge surprise.
Right.
I don't think they were. And they did keep the game close.
Right.
I mean, it was 24-12 at halftime. I
Right.
thought that was closer than I was thinking it might be. And then we saw that they were close to Florida at halftime, but then Florida pulled away and kind of. But they kept this game close.
They did.
So I think Tennessee should be very proud of the way they played.
I think they should
I think fans should be proud of the way they played. Right? I mean, like I said, aside from winning the game, I don't know how much more you could ask for, and I don't think the prospects of winning were very high. So this is about as good as the outcome as they could have had. I think.
I agree with that.
They just had, like you said, let's say that quarterback just throws it up there before he gets hit or gets out of bounds. You never know what happens. Then they had other mistakes. Obviously, they had that muff punt at the start of the game.
Right.
So yeah, they didn't play like perfectly, obviously. But and then they lost 31-26. So
That's right. And again, to recap Tennessee's season, they're at Alabama this week. I don't see them winning that game. They're at Kentucky. I don't see them winning that game right now. They host Georgia again. I don't see them winning that game. They'll beat South Alabama. They'll beat Vanderbilt. So I think Tennessee finishes 6-6. And goes to a minor bowl, but still goes to a bowl, which is a great win for Tennessee in the first year of a new head coach. So I think Tennessee's on the right track, and I think next year Tennessee is going to be a lot better than they were this year. So that pretty much closes the book on Tennessee. We will see, though, how Alabama and Georgia function in that game to see really if they're still on pace to be the
Yeah,
teams that we thought they were.
in Tennessee having these primetime games like they did last week against
Right.
Ole Miss and playing close in them,
Right.
I think that looks good to recruits too. They see
Yes.
Tennessee on a big stage, it's sold out. They have the checkerboard crowd at night. They play in a 13th ranked team. They play them very close.
Right.
This just helps Tennessee. You know what
Oh,
I mean?
no
Like,
question, it helps Tennessee. That's exactly right. Yeah.
when you're on the big stage like this in primetime, you have to play those games. Especially you have to play those games close because
Right.
all the eyes are on you. Then
Right.
you're gonna look pretty bad if you get blown out. You know?
Let me look real quick at Michigan State. Michigan State is ranked number 10. And I think they're kind of flying under the radar a little bit. They've got a new coach, but they are 6-0. They've beaten Western Kentucky. Well, doesn't matter. Rutgers, doesn't matter. They've beaten, let me look and see here. Let me start it over. They've beaten Northwestern. They beat Youngstown State, Miami of Florida, which is not very good, Nebraska, Western Kentucky, Rutgers, and Indiana. So really, there's no games there that I see really challenge them too much, okay? The meat of their schedule's coming up. They have this week off. Then they host Michigan, right? Which if they be, and then they play at Purdue, which it looks like Purdue may be a formidable opponent. They host Maryland. They're at Ohio State and host Penn State. So my point being in bringing that up, if Michigan State was to run the table and go undefeated, I think they're in the playoff. What do you think?
Definitely, yeah.
So they've got their destiny is in their own hands.
I think so. I mean, I don't think anybody can. I don't think anybody can say. I'm pulling up the rankings. I don't think anybody can make a case for them not to be in if they go undefeated and beat all those teams they're about to play.
Right.
And plus, they're already ranked number 9th. The only undefeated teams ahead of them are Oklahoma State, Michigan, who they will have beaten if they go undefeated, and Oklahoma, who's one of those teams you're going to lose, and
Right.
Cincinnati. So, I mean, even just pure record-wise, I just think, forget who they beat, I think they'll be up in the top 4 probably.
Right. And now let's talk about Michigan for a minute. I mean, Michigan has beaten Western Michigan, discount, Washington, not very good, Northern Illinois, I mean, come on, Rutgers, come on, Wisconsin, Nebraska. Now, Michigan hasn't beaten anybody yet. The meat of their schedule is coming up, right? They have to play Northwestern this week. Then they're at Michigan State. They host Indiana. They're at Penn State. They're at Maryland, and then they play Ohio State. So same applies for Michigan, right?
They're currently sitting 3 spots ahead of Michigan State, so they're definitely in if they win out.
Right. But my point being, Michigan State and Michigan have not been tested yet, but they will be, and we're going to find out a lot about them.
And they control their own destiny.
And they control their own destiny. Now let's look at Ohio State, okay? Ohio State is currently ranked number 5, okay? We pretty much know how their season has gone. They beat Minnesota to open the season. They lost to Oregon, but Oregon is a pretty good football team. They beat Tulsa and Akron and Rutgers and Maryland very badly, so we expect that. They're at Indiana this week. I expect them to win that game. And then the meat of their schedule comes up, right? They play Penn State. They're at Nebraska. They play Purdue at home. And they play Michigan State at home. And they're at Michigan. Now, look at those 3 teams: Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State. Michigan State have not been tested, but they will be, and we'll find out about them, and they control their own destiny. Ohio State has been tested a little bit. All right, they've had to play Oregon, and they failed that test. Okay. But I think if Ohio State wins out, especially the fact that they sit at number 5, I think you're going to see them with a very, very, very good chance of making the playoff. Assuming that there's not 4 undefeated teams ahead of them. You follow me? Which there really wouldn't be, right? Because if they win all these games, they're going to knock out most of the other undefeated teams.
Yeah, and Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, there'll only be 1 undefeated between those 2. So that's 1. Cincinnati's undefeated, that's 2 undefeated teams.
Right.
And Georgia, that's 3 undefeated teams. And, and they'll probably knock out the other ones. So there'll just be 3, and there'll be them.
Right.
Now, you have Alabama, too. But, again, if Georgia goes undefeated, that means they were beating Alabama, so Ohio State's in. So,
and see, here's what I'm getting at. All right, by bringing up those 3 teams, here's what I'm getting at. Okay, let me get back to my to where I want to be here a minute, and then I'll let you know what I'm getting at. Let's look at the top 25, okay? Here's what I'm getting at, all right? If Ohio State wins out, Michigan's gone, Penn State's gone, Michigan State's gone, okay? Oregon is going to be the key because they beat Ohio State. But let's say Oregon stays behind Ohio State.
But for them to be 5 points behind right now, I don't think they're going to jump them over Ohio State.
Right.
Plus, Oregon's schedule is not as tough as Ohio State's coming up.
Right. And going back to what we talked about before, Oregon was in the top 10 when they beat Ohio State. Stanford was unranked when they beat Oregon. Okay, follow me here. Let's say Georgia goes undefeated, Cincinnati goes undefeated, Oklahoma goes undefeated. They're the top 3 teams. Okay. Now, let's say that Alabama beats Georgia in the SEC championship game. Okay. Now you're going to have an undefeated Cincinnati, an undefeated Oklahoma, a 1-loss Georgia, a 1-loss Alabama, and a 1-loss Ohio State. Who of those 3 teams gets the 2 other spots?
Then they'll give it to Cincinnati, Oklahoma, Alabama, and Georgia, I think.
Okay.
Because Georgia's going to be number 1 if they lose to Alabama, right?
Right.
They're not going to drop them past Ohio State.
Correct.
So they'll be in.
So
Alabama's currently 1 spot ahead of Ohio State.
Right.
So I don't see how they have Ohio State jump Alabama if Alabama knocks out the number 1 team. So they're going to be in. And then if Oklahoma and Cincinnati are undefeated, Ohio State's not undefeated.
So I guess I bring that all up to say that Ohio State has to have a perfect storm happen, right? In other words,
I wouldn't say it's perfect. They just need Georgia
They need Georgia to beat Alabama.
Yeah.
They need Georgia to beat
that's
Alabama.
The thing.
Right, they do.
Teams like Iowa need a perfect storm to happen.
Right,
you know?
right. But Ohio State has to be a big Georgia fan right now. They have to say, look, we have to win out and take care of our business, and Georgia has to win out, and then they're in.
But again, though, like, I mean, I think that's what's going to that's how it's going to play out, just because Alabama is currently ahead of Ohio State, right? But then again, though, why can they not have Ohio State? Well, they can't do that. I mean,
we don't know. Listen, we've already talked about an SEC bias, but again, I'll say, like I said the last few weeks, when the first committee rankings come out of the playoff rankings, it's possible that Ohio State could be ahead of Alabama.
Well, the committee wants Georgia and Alabama to both have a chance of being off, so that's why they dropped Alabama to where they dropped them. Because really, though, right now Alabama has 1 loss to an unranked team. Ohio State has 1 loss to, what was Oregon when they beat them?
They were in the top 10.
Top 10. Why is Alabama ahead of Ohio State?
I agree with you.
Somebody explain that to me.
I agree with you.
I want to. Somebody who votes on the AP Top 25. Tell me why you think Alabama's ahead of Ohio State. And if you tell me it's because you just think Alabama's a better team and forget about their record, then why? Then you think they're actually worse than Cincinnati? Then person,
Yeah.
you gonna tell me that?
Yeah.
Because if that's the case, like I said initially, you put them at number 2. Then if you just think they're a good team and forget their record.
Right. Well, that's why I think,
or put them at 3 below Oklahoma if you think Oklahoma's better, but whatever.
This is my thinking.
I find it hard to believe anybody really thinks, if you throw out the records, I find it hard to believe anybody really thinks Cincinnati's a better football team than Alabama.
Right, You're right. But this is what I think is going to happen. Okay, I'll give you my scenario. I think when the first rankings come out next week, or what's today? Yeah, probably come out in 2 weeks. I thought. Okay, or actually they may come out next week. I'm not sure, but anyway, they're coming out soon. I think here's what it's going to be: Georgia will be number 1, Cincinnati will be number 2, Oklahoma 3. I think Ohio State's going to be 4, and Alabama's going to be 5.
It should be.
Here's why I say that: because the committee knows that Alabama's going to play the number 1 team eventually. So even if they're number 5,
they can jump them ahead.
Exactly. Now, assuming that happens, okay, I think what's going to happen is, let's assume again that Georgia, Cincinnati, Oklahoma stay undefeated. If Alabama beats Georgia, I think what you're going to see happen is you're going to see Alabama will end up being or Oklahoma will be number 1, Alabama will be number 2, Cincinnati or Georgia will be 3, and they'll drop Cincinnati to 4.
Undefeated team, they'll drop them. Okay.
Because they know that gets them in the playoff,
right.
But it's going to force them to play
the
number 1 team in the country, which at that point will be Oklahoma.
It doesn't matter who they play.
Yeah. So I think that's what they're jockeying for right now. Now, the only thing that would throw a wrench in that is, obviously, if Ohio State loses again, they're out. If Alabama stubs their toe and loses to Auburn, they're out. Those things could happen. But I think if everything goes the way we think, I think that's how it's going to play out.
Yeah, and we act like Ohio State's only chance would be Georgia to beat Alabama, but Alabama could very well lose to Auburn.
Sure they could. Sure they could. And Ohio State could lose to Penn State or Michigan. We don't know that, right?
Yeah. What do you think happens? I don't want to get too far into the weeds of things, but if Alabama loses to Auburn,
right,
they're out of the playoff. Alabama,
correct.
But what if they then beat Georgia? Then Georgia lost to 2 losses.
Well,
Alabama.
here's
you're going to keep Georgia in it. Then
here's what you got to look at. Okay, let's take a look at the SEC rankings at the moment. Okay, if you look at the ACC,
they won't be in anything.
Right. In other words, right now Alabama's 3-1 in the conference. Okay, Auburn's 2-1. Ole Miss is 2-1. Okay. If Alabama loses, they're not going to be in the SEC championship game.
All right. I guess my point is, what if Georgia loses an SEC championship game to anybody? If they lose to a one-loss Alabama, I think, like we said, both those teams would probably be in. But what if they lose to a team that's not Alabama, that's not as good as Alabama, like Ole Miss or like one of these teams? Do you think Georgia still gets in?
Well, that could be a question mark.
Because forget about if the records. Losing to Alabama just has a certain. It carries with it less of a weight than losing to like Auburn or like.
Let's look at the teams that have 1 loss right now. This is going to solve the problem right here. Ole Miss has 1 loss in the conference, right? They play LSU this week, and then they play Auburn. So in other words, if Ole Miss beats LSU, and especially if they beat Auburn, Auburn's got 2 losses now in the conference. They're out, even if they beat Alabama. Okay, that would put Ole Miss in the West as the Western champion. So that'll solve itself. Now, if you look at, and that pretty much solves itself.
I guess my question is, another one of my questions is it possible that Georgia could be playing a 2-loss team in the championship? Is that possible?
It's possible.
Okay,
it's possible.
Let's look at it that way. What if they lose to a 2-loss team? Are you going to keep Georgia in there then? If they lose
I don't know. I still think again, I used this term last week. I didn't want to use it, but we talked about it. I think if Georgia goes undefeated, if Georgia goes 12-0, all right, and they get in the SEC championship game, and they lose a tight game to a 2-loss team, let's say it's Ole Miss.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't think Ole Miss will have 2 losses because if you look at their schedule, I guess my
point is it's possible that a 2-loss team could play in the championship.
It's possible, okay? I still think Georgia gets in as the number 4 team.
So Georgia basically can do whatever they want as long as they go undefeated in the regular season.
I think so. And as long as they don't get blown out in the SEC championship game. You follow me?
But why should a blowout... Really?
Because that shows you that maybe they're just not...
I get, but if they go undefeated for the rest of the season and they've won these games as they're winning them, one blowout's like a blip on the map. Like, it's not like they've played close games all year and they've been blowing out teams up to this point.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, they've proven they're pretty good.
You're right.
Like let's say they blow out the rest of their schedule, then they get blown out by Ole Miss or Alabama in the SEC championship game. I feel like, well, if you're going to put them in with a close loss, put them in with a blowout loss too, if that's what you're going to do. Because, and like I said, the only difference would have been that if they had close games all year and they barely squeaked by, and then they got blown out, maybe you don't put them in.
Well, here's the blueprint I'm using for my scenario. Last year, Notre Dame was the number 2 team in the country behind Alabama. They were undefeated. They had beaten Clemson during the season. They played the ACC championship game because you remember Notre Dame was eligible last year. And Clemson pretty much blew them out, okay? Yeah. And they still dropped Notre Dame only to 4 and put them in the playoff, okay, with 1 loss. So my point, and Notre Dame had beaten teams pretty handily all year long. My point is I think there's some reward. I hate to use that word, but I think there is going undefeated during the regular season if you're number 1 or 2.
That's my point. They can get blown out and they'll still be in there.
And you make a good point. That's right. So I think they're in. I think unless they lose a regular season game, they're in. Okay? I really believe that. Now, Cincinnati's only test is going to be SMU, which you just brought up. But I think they're in too because I don't see anybody beating them.
But think about how... What's the word you want to use? I don't know. Amped up SMU is going to be though.
No question. and where is that? I mean, I think you looked at that. Let me look at it real quick.
I think that's the last. It's the last game of the year.
No, it's second to last.
Second to last.
It's in Cincinnati.
Yeah. Okay. So SMU have a chance to. I mean, after that, if Cincinnati's undefeated at that point, they just have to play East Carolina. They'll probably win that.
Yeah.
So SMU knows that they have a chance to knock off Cincinnati, knock them out of the playoff.
They're undefeated. SMU. Okay.
Yeah, I think they're going to be. That's going to be like their bowl game, I think, for SMU. I mean, like
I agree.
That's going to be bigger than their bowl game.
I agree. I think that's going to be the key game of the season right there.
See, time is to be announced or to be determined. I bet you they put that on some type of game day, primetime thing.
Yeah, it's got to be. Yeah. I mean, because that's that's going to be the key game for Cincinnati to determine whether they get into
unless maybe SMU enters that with a couple of losses, maybe it's not as big of a deal. But
but I looked at their schedule. I don't see any team that can beat them. But so anyway, I think there's a lot of things that could happen. Again, when we get the first committee rankings, I think we'll know a little bit more. But I think we're starting to see just a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I think we've decided now that Georgia and Cincinnati, assuming they win out in the regular season, I think are going to be in. Okay, I think Oklahoma, we still don't know about them. They've got to play Oklahoma State. Let me see who else Oklahoma has to play.
But if they win out, they're in too, though. They're number 3 right now.
Yeah, if they win out, they're definitely in. They play Kansas this week, Texas Tech, Baylor, Iowa State, Oklahoma State. So Oklahoma State will be the only game. So Georgia, Cincinnati, and Oklahoma, if they win out, and remember both. Here's the only catch though. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the Big 12 has a championship game. I think they do. Let me look real quick and make sure of that. The Big 12 does not have divisions, so I'm not sure if they take the top 2 teams and play them off. I think they do. So Oklahoma would have to possibly play Oklahoma State again in the Big 12 championship. So we'll see about that. But I think bottom line is if Georgia, Cincinnati, and Oklahoma win out, they're in. All right. I think Georgia can afford to lose the SEC championship game and still be in. I think Oklahoma cannot afford to lose their championship game and still be in. Yeah. Okay. I think Alabama has to win out. They cannot lose another game. Okay, which means that they've got to beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. I think Ohio State obviously has to win out, and they have to hope that. I think if they win out, but I think if they win out, they're in because I think they're going to be ahead of Alabama in the first rankings. We already said Michigan State control their own destiny. Okay, but again, one loss and they're done. Iowa has to have a perfect storm happen, but they're not out of it yet. So
but just to briefly, I know we've already rehearsed, but like you said, even though Ohio State may be ahead of Alabama, like you said, I think they're going to do that knowing that if Alabama knocks out number 1, they'll jump over.
Correct.
So I think Ohio State still needs Georgia to beat.
They still need Georgia to beat Alabama. Or Alabama to slip up and lose to Auburn. One of the two. Okay. So I think we're looking at a scenario here in my mind where your playoff teams are going to be Georgia, Cincinnati, Oklahoma, and either Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, or Michigan State, depending upon what happens.
I won't be so quick to say it's definitely going to be Oklahoma, though, because I don't know what's going to happen with that.
That's true.
Thing.
That's true. But they control their own destiny.
Yeah, but I'm just saying I don't know if Oklahoma's really going to be there.
Yeah, I agree. I think the teams that control their own... Here's the teams that I think control their own destiny. Georgia, Cincinnati, Oklahoma, Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, and Oklahoma State. I think they all control their own destiny. In other words, if they all win out, I think you're going to have...
Well, not really, because we just said if Ohio State wins out and Alabama knocks out number 1, they're not in. So they don't control their own destiny.
Well, they do, because I said they're going to be ahead of...
Yeah, but I thought you said they're going to put Alabama at 5, knowing that if Alabama knocks out number 1, they'll jump them up into the playoffs.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think you're... Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right.
I thought that's what you said.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm probably misspeaking there, but yeah, you're right. No, you're exactly right. But I guess maybe the right way for me to say it would be that I think your playoff teams are going to be 4 of the following teams. How about that if I say it that way? Georgia, Cincinnati, Oklahoma, Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, Oklahoma State, or Michigan State. I'm not going to say who's controls those. That's where the playoffs going to come from, I think, based on what we've just talked about. How's that?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so let's finish like we do every week by looking at week number 8 coming up. Let's see. We've got Notre Dame hosting Southern California. Again, not a big game when it comes to national implications, but it is for Notre Dame to continue undefeated. It is for Cincinnati as well, based on what we talk about. Outside of that, I don't see any games that really jump out at me. Ole Miss is hosting LSU. That's important for Ole Miss, for them to have a chance to play in the SEC championship game. Clemson is at Pittsburgh. I think that helps Clemson possibly get back into the top 25, which doesn't really have any implications. Tennessee, Alabama is a big game from the standpoint of Alabama. Obviously needs to win. I think they will.
Oregon, UCLA. I mean, Oregon, UCLA is horrible. That could be
that'll be okay. I still think
Iowa State could be Oklahoma State. Maybe
they could. Iowa State was previously ranked in the top 10 before they lost some games, but I don't see any marquee matchups. Let's put it that way.
Some possible upsets, but not any really marquee matchups.
Correct. I think that's the case. Then when we go to, I don't want to talk too much about week 9 because it's still far enough ahead. We'll talk about that next week. But looking at it, I see some games in week 9 that could be really, really big games, and we'll talk about those. Definitely talk about those next week because there are some huge games in week number 9. So that wraps up our college football recap for week number 7. Once again, remember, as I tell you every week, at PressBoxPod is our Twitter handle. We would love for you to get on there. Nathan's put up some great questions and some great things to think about and some great little tweets about the podcast itself. At PressBoxPod, let us know who your favorite teams are. Answer our poll questions. Get involved. We'd love to have you do that. At PressBoxPod is also our Instagram handle. We'd love for you to interact with us on that as well. And then the PressBox Podcast is our YouTube channel with full episodes as well as great segments of some of our better episodes from the past. So that's our college football recap for week 7. We're looking forward to week 8 as we come up, and then week 9 looks like a big week as we get closer and closer to the first college football playoff rankings. College football heating up very quickly. So for Nathan Miranda, our producer, I'm Ralph Miranda. That's been the PressBox Podcast, and we'll see you next week.